Everyone. My name is Chris Caplice. I'm the executive director here at the center, and I'm mainly talking to you today as my role in research, which is as the founder and co-director now, along with Dave Carell, of the MIT FreightLab. And what I want to do is talk about some of the research we're doing here at MIT, but put it in context of why we're doing it. And I've been talking about this topic for a while. Some of you might have seen some of this, but the whole idea is disrupting the dominant design of transportation procurement. Just to level set, this is mainly going to be about North American truckload transportation. So if you're more interested in ocean or something in another continent, I'm not going to cover it as much. Some of the concepts can apply, but I'm mainly talking about North American truckload, which is a massive market, right? It's over $300 billion. There's over 100,000 carriers, whether they're owner operators or large carriers in there. So it's a really interesting and complex market. So like I said, I'll talk for about 30 minutes and then any questions you guys have. So let me get started. First, FreightLab. This is something I started about 10 years ago, and Dave Carell joined about 2 to 3 years ago and is now my co-director. And I have 2 PhD students there and a number of master's students as well. And what we do is study anything that moves. We do a lot of trucking analysis, a lot of work in disruptions and how that affects the freight market. David does a lot of work in the driver initiative, understanding how you can improve driver efficiency and driver quality of life. And Angie's doing a lot of work that I'll talk about later, dealing with this topic, which is transportation procurement at both the strategic or planning and execution levels. But if you're interested in anything with FreightLab, please come here, join, and you can get on our newsletter. Also, just for fair disclosure, I'm also chief scientist at a company called DAT, Freight and Analytics. I'm part of their DAT IQ team. They acquired the Freight Market Intelligence Consortium that I was part of at Chainalytics, and that's now here. The reason why I bring this up is because some of the results I'll show are from DAT IQ. And so the data is there. And so these two things come together, what I do at MIT and what we're studying in the market at DAT. Okay, so from a shipper's perspective, transportation management is a series of tasks, a continuum, right? And you have these execution tasks, shipment consolidation, fleet routing, carrier selection things, and you have planning tasks, whether it's network design, tactical modeling, sizing of your private fleet, or procurement, as we typically refer to it. And what I'm going to point out, though, there's a gap between these, between the planning and the execution. And the interesting thing about transportation procurement, it spans the gap. And I'll explain why in just a second. But this is the whole thing I'm trying to get to, is there's a dominant design, and I'll explain that later. And it's because of the problems with it is because there's this gap there. So what is the current truckload procurement process? Well, it's kind of settled in for the last 2 decades into a two-stage process, or 2 moments of truth, if you will. The first, there's an annual RFP, and this is where the shipper holds a reverse auction where carriers are awarded the rights to haul freight over a certain lane over a certain period of time at an established price. Now, those contracts are binding in price. They're not binding in volume being guaranteed by the shipper or capacity guaranteed by the carrier. Everyone on this call probably already knows that, but just to make sure. Then what happens after the annual RFP is that the lanes, the winning assignments, are fed into this routing guide, which is in a shipper's transportation management system. And then that is used when a shipment drops. It's matched to the routing guide to the carrier that won during the RFP, and they're tendered. And it goes out there, and that's how it works perfectly. You set up the contracts in the annual RFP, they get fed into the routing guide. When a load appears, it gets tendered to that assigned or primary carrier. So how have we gotten into this at CTL? Well, in the 80s and 90s, before I got to CTL, there was a lot of work applying operations research, or OR, to trucking. A lot of papers published and software developed to improve lesson truckload and truckload operations. Yossi Sheffi did a lot of this, Warren Powell when he was here. So there was a lot of real interesting applications of OR to transportation. In the mid 1990s, when I got here, to the 2000s, there was a shift from just the carrier operations to the interface between shipper and carrier. And so we did some of the initial work on optimization-based procurement for annual truckload auctions, those RFPs I was talking about. We developed software for this, and the objective, again, was to improve the relationship between shippers and carriers. And the key insight that came out of that research from the 90s and early 2000s is the strength and importance of economies of scope. We all know economies of scale. If I buy more, my unit cost should go down. Economies of scope is different. And that the idea is that the cost of serving one lane depends on the cost of serving another lane coming out. So if I have loads into Miami, my price will be different if I have a lot of loads coming out of Miami, which never happens, right? But the idea of economies of scope rather than economies of scale matters in truckload, because actually there are diseconomies of scale in truckload. If you have 10 loads a week going into Florida, carriers will not be happy if that suddenly goes up to 20, right? So there's sometimes diseconomies on certain lanes. And so it's more about the balance or the economies of scope. So the idea is, if you want to match it in with what the carrier is already doing, and this naturally developed into, well, what if we let the carriers determine when they submit a bid, what their bundles are, their packages, because they can put these whole bundles together and therefore capturing their economies of scope, saving them money, saving the shipper money. That was the thought. And so based on that, a bunch of software was developed and is widely used out there. Jagger has tools out there. Manhattan has tools. Most 3PLs using some optimization-based procurement process out there. And they all are, despite the bells and whistles, they're all the same. They're a mixed integer linear program, right? And what they're doing is they're optimizing the assignment of a carrier to a lane based on the volume, based on certain characteristics. Now, using a mixed integer linear program, an optimization model, has been wonderful. It does a lot of really great things. First, it allows you to include those package or combinatorial bids. Second, it allows you to apply constraints or certain restrictions. If you want to restrict, say, the number of carriers, or make sure you have a certain number of, say, minority-based carriers, you can do that in the mixed integer linear program, which is very positive. You can make trade-offs between financial and non-financial metrics. And so let me just spend a second talking about that, because I think that's something that people don't realize is something you can do. And this applies to procurement in general, not just transportation. But when you think of a financial and non-financial metrics, they're very hard to combine, because my non-financial is like an array of different factors. My level of service, it could be on time, it could be if they're an incumbent, it could be what their insurance level is. We have all these different characteristics, and I want to combine that with the rate that they give us, right? So how do I bring those together? And one way is to consider this continuum of ways that you can influence it. One is to be neutral and to not care. So like, if I didn't care what the color of my carrier's trucks or trailers were, right, whether they're orange, yellow, blue, whatever, then I'm neutral. I don't care about the color, right? And there's other factors you might not really care about. But there are some that you might require. For example, you might require certain insurance level. And so you just want to require that goes into a constraint. You might want to ban certain things. And again, below a certain insurance level or a certain number of violations, right? You have a certain banning, so you can require or ban. But more interestingly, you can do those trade-offs in the middle where you favor a certain carrier because of its certain characteristics, or you disfavor. And that all happens in the objective function. And so if you're not familiar with optimization, that's okay. But essentially this little square up here with all the Greek is saying you're minimizing this thing I'm circling is the objective function. And that's all the costs and assignments. And it's subject to all these constraints, right? So my trade-offs are done in the objective function. For example, if I want to favor incumbency, which most shippers want to because changing, is a hassle. So you want to favor them a little bit, whether it's 5%, 10%, you can include that in here. So the assignment favors the incumbent. Doesn't mean they're getting paid more. They just get favored more in the assignment. You would actually reduce their costs, right? You reduce their costs to make them more attractive. And you can justify this as an engineering cost, right? Because the cost of bringing a new carrier on might be higher, or it could be that you're comfortable with the devil you know, and you don't want to go to the devil you don't know. But there's all these different things you can do. And by using this favoring, disfavoring, rewarding, penalizing, you can combine those level of service attributes with your cost. Pretty nice. And because you can do this along with the constraints and everything, you can create multiple scenarios. And this is what happens when shippers run bids, right? They spend about 3 months getting the network together, and then they give the carriers about 2 weeks to respond. And we'll talk about that. And then they spend 2 to 3 to 4 months analyzing. And what are they doing when they're analyzing? They're running all these scenarios. They run the base case, show me the lowest cost solution. And usually every carrier who submitted gets at least one lane, right? But it's totally unworkable. So then you start restricting it by adding these factors. You favor incumbents by 8%. Maybe you single source a region to a single carrier. Maybe you try a restriction to only 10 carriers. And you keep building this tree, right, with all these different factors included, and you eventually end up with one that you like. And this is usually called the business optimal. Now, every time you do this, a property of optimization is that anytime I have a base case optimization, if I add a constraint to it, right, I will never improve. I will only get worse. The best I can do is stay the same. So what happens when you add these scenarios on, your quote savings or the change will always go down. Always. It can't go up because you're adding constraints. So what does this mean? Well, what you're trying to do and what the mixed integer linear program does, which is awesome, it lets you do a trade-off between the direct and indirect costs. And the direct costs are what you're paying, and the indirect costs are the things that might come later down the road, so they're not as well known, right? They're the service levels, damage, all those kind of things. And what you're really doing here is you're finding this business optimal, right? And so that's what the mixed integer linear program lets you do when a shipper runs an annual RFP. So this might be old hat to a lot of you, but just to see where it all fits in. And so what I want to talk about, though, is this process is the dominant design. This is the dominant design for truckload procurement. I run this very sophisticated, very precise scalpel level process to do carrier to lane assignment strategically. And then I throw it into the blender that is a routing guide. And that's what's used in execution. And this is the dominant design. It's been around for a long time. Using an auction came out because of deregulation in the 80s. And it took about 10 years, to be honest, for shippers, carriers, the whole market to realize what prices were. If any of you were still operating in the 80s, and it's a completely different market than it is now. And so when you have uncertainty in what something should be priced, the most efficient and best way to determine the value of something like a lane is to run a bid, run an auction, and see what the market says. And we've been doing that now for about 30 years. And so this is the dominant design. And so the next question might be, well, there's two probably. So what? And then the other is, what's a dominant design? And so let me explain what a dominant design is, then I'll answer the so what. So a dominant design in anything is where a product or a service is introduced and it gains, quote, the allegiance of the marketplace. And it's not perfect for any one company, but it's good enough for many. So it's known as a satisficer, but it's not optimal for any one designer. And I'll give some examples in a second. So you go through these stages when a process or a product's introduced. You have a lot of innovation you see and during the fluid phase. Eventually it settles into a transitional phase where people focus on the process innovation and the product itself doesn't change too much. And then you get into this specific phase where there's complacency. And that's where right now procurement for transportation is. There's this complacent attitude that this is what you do. You run your annual bid, right? And then you feed it to the routing guide. And that's kind of the dominant design that we see in practice. And so some examples, cell phones. I guarantee you, if you show me your cell phone, it will look just like mine. It'll be glass on the top. You probably can't replace the battery, right? And it's very much a touch screen. But think about the first one you had, from a flip phone to all this that it started. Any of you BlackBerry users, think of all the variations that you had, and now they all pretty much look the same, right? That's a dominant design. Is it the best? If you used BlackBerry, you know it's not the best because some people are really good on those keyboards. Another example, bicycles. When they were first brought out in the 1800s, they were all over the place, very different designs, 2 wheels, 4 wheels, big wheel, little wheel. But now most bikes look the same. They might be, you know, the size of the tire might change if it's a snow, meant for road, meant for mountain, but generally they're the same, 2 wheels, same size, pedal in the middle, rear tire is tied to the chain, right? One last example, and this is keyboards. The QWERTY keyboard came in over, what is that, 150 years ago. So it's been here for a while, and it mainly came from the initial typesetting. And then, you know, you look through all the different typewriters and it's still here on your laptop. Is it the best? No. It's been shown that QWERTY is not the most efficient allocations, especially in English, of typing, but it's a dominant design. It's not going away anytime soon. So back to truckload procurement. So we have this dominant design, which is another way of saying that everyone does it. No one quite knows why anymore, but this is the way we do it. And so what? And so the problem is it's hard to change something that generally has worked, right? If something's working, it's really hard to change that practice. You need a crisis. You need a burning platform. And in 2017, 2018, we had our burning platform because we've had tight capacity before, but nothing really like 2017, 2018. There's a lot of factors coming into this that we can talk about. But what I'm showing here is data from DATIQ, the Freight Market Intelligence Consortium, showing contract rates, average national, that's the blue, and the orange is a spot rate. A contract rate is the thing that's done in the annual RFP. A spot rate is the one that's done a one-off, right? And you can see that it just climbed dramatically up, and during that time frame through the fall and winter of 2017 into 2018, and it really had some ramifications. All over the press. A lot of senior transportation executives lost their jobs. A lot of CEOs started complaining in their annual reports that the reason why they weren't profitable was because of transportation. It's always good to be mentioned in a CEO statement, usually not for transportation prices though. So what this was essentially is shippers getting punched in the mouth, right? To quote the philosopher Mike Tyson, everyone has a plan. Everyone uses the dominant design till they get punched in the mouth. And this is shippers getting punched. And so you had a lot of interest and activity here, say, hey, we got to fix this, a lot of resources coming in, and you saw some change, but then they got punched again in the pandemic. So I'm showing here the first peak, set of peaks over here. That's the 2017, 2018 timeframe. But as I go forward up to here, this is the pandemic, right? The dropping of April, May, but then the rapid increase. Look how far the spot rates went in a month. And this is a 4-week moving average based on weekly rates. And so it's still up there. It's still incredibly high. So they got punched again. And so maybe a lesson will come through this time, that maybe the dominant design of annual RFPs, maybe that isn't the right thing to do anymore. So to quote another person, Rahm Emanuel, never want to let a serious crisis go to waste, especially when it happens twice within 3 years, right? And so maybe this is the message. So let's go to that second stage of the process that we've ignored so far. The annual RFP fits to the routing guide. What happens in the routing guide? Well, in the best case, a tender goes to the primary carrier and they accept it. And to be honest, in a normal market, that happens 80 to 90% of the time, right? It usually happens. If it doesn't, it gets rejected, remember, because it's not binding on capacity or volume. It goes to the backup carriers in the routing guide, and they will take it. If they don't, then it goes out to some kind of spot market, whether the shipper goes to a load board, to a broker that does it, or to some other mechanism that goes off for a one load price. It doesn't guarantee pricing for anything else. It's just for that one load. Call that a spot. And I can look at different markets, and from left to right here, 2015 to 2016 to 2017, it goes from soft to a tight market. You can see the size of the pie charts in blue. That's what goes to primary tender, or the primary acceptance rate, decreases from 80 to 63%. And it's probably lower than that in 2020, right? So what's happening is the share going to the routing guide and going to the spot is increasing. Why does that matter? Well, some research that we've done here with C.H. Robinson has been a great partner doing this with us, their TMC division. we've been looking at their the different shippers they have under managed transportation, excuse me, and we can see certain things. For example, this shows the depth of routing guide from the first alternate to the second to the third, fourth, and fifth. And on the vertical axis, the percentage. This is the first time I noticed there's a typo in percentage. Wow. Percentage increase over the primary carrier rate. So you can see that typically on the first alternate, you're talking 4 to 6%, right? Roughly 5% over that RFP rate for the primary carrier. But look how much it increases as you go to second, third, fourth, and fifth. It can get quite high, and the colors correspond to years, right? And so you're talking blue is 2015, then the 2016, and the orange is the highest one. So in a tight market, it gets worse. But even in a soft market, you have this increasing price. But wait, it gets worse. If you go out of the routing guide, right into the routing guide, you can see on average, it's a 9 to 11 or 12% increase. But if you go to spot, wow, it's a 30%. And it can be even higher at times. This is the average increase if you go to spot during different markets. So it's a bad thing, right? It's a bad thing if you go off your primary, go to your routing guide alternates, or go into the spot market. It gets increasingly worse. So how do these routing guides actually perform? Well, this is a project we did last year, again with C.H. Robinson. And we looked at this and we saw what happens is actually routing guides degrade over time. It's like, sure. And so we're trying to quantify that and find out how much it is. So I recommend any shipper to look at this. You're going to run into two problems. You probably don't keep a record of what was actually awarded, and it's hard to match that up to your routing guide, because what we found is that routing guides are living documents, right? They keep changing, and that's another discussion to have. But it's very worthwhile to compare what you bid to what you actually did, and what you'll see is you have a constant degradation of the number of primary carriers that you're assigning. And so this is something we're ongoing and doing another project this year that's looking at something a little different. It's looking at the ghost freight. And what that is volumes and lanes that you awarded to a carrier during the RFP, but it never materialized during the course of a year. So they bid on it, assumed it was going to be there, and it never shows up. And we have results for that coming out at Research Fest later this month. I want to say on the 21st. I'll encourage you to come and see the presentation, but the end result is it's a lot higher than you think. A lot more lanes are awarded that are never actually assigned during that year for that shipper. All right. Okay, so the RFP process broke down, right? We had a lot of bleeding out into spot and contract. It was causing transportation executives to get fired. Bad things happened. So what do? What should shippers focus on? Well, the whole idea, I think, is to stop treating the RFP as a blender for everything. It's not for everything. Every lane shouldn't be bid out. You need to segment. And so when you segment the two extremes of a lane, which is just the origin destination pair, is it consistent, reliable, and balanced, right? Is there a lot of consistent volume? And that can be in terms of, throughout the year, it's consistent. Throughout the week, it's consistent. Is it high enough? And then at the other extreme is the variable, irregular, unbalanced lanes. 1 a year, 3 a year, 10 a year, where it's very infrequent, or maybe it's 50 a year, but they all happen in a 1 week period, right? And so separate those as the extremes, right? Then we can think of 3 big categories of how we can work with our assets, work with our carriers. On the left is dedicated or private fleet. I'm just going to lump them together and call them dedicated. At the far right is dynamic, and that's the spot and all that, but I like to call them dynamic. And in the middle, you have the contract. So dedicated, if you haven't done this analysis as a shipper, you should. Where will a private fleet or a dedicated fleet work within your network? It's an engineered solution. It's fairly well defined how to do this. Most carriers with 3PLs will do this for you. And it's essentially looking for that consistent volume that's balanced, that you can maintain a regular flow of vehicles. And I highly encourage you to talk with different carriers about this, because you want to make a decision whether you want to do it just private fleet, your own asset, or use a dedicated with a carrier's assets. And there's a benefit there because they can balance beyond your network, but that's another discussion. So you segment out and you go to dedicated. The other extreme that shippers usually don't focus on is that dynamic stuff. I've worked with a lot of shippers in the past when I was running these bids back in the 90s, 2000s, and they would almost put everything out to bid. One load a year, put it out to bid, get a contract rate, right? Or they lump it up to a state to state. And the problem with that is that you're not going to get capacity to it. You'll have capacity from the carrier if they have a truck in the area. So you want to think about how you're going to handle these onesie twosies. And so there's some shippers that are saying, you know what, if they're less than 15 loads a year from the previous year, I'm not even going to put it in the RFP. I'm going to go automatically to a freight broker, a digital freight broker, or someone through an API automatically, because I don't want to spend the time dealing with a lane that has 2 loads over the year or 5 loads. And so there's a lot of things you can do here. And I think that brokers, whether they're traditional or digital, are a great way because they're aggregators. They can handle some of those, but I don't think you need to plan for those in a contract rate necessarily. And then there's the big lion's share in the middle, the contracts. And these are the ones kind of in the middle. And traditionally, we've had that same kind of truckload contract, binding in price, but not in capacity or volume. And maybe that can be expanded as well. So this is what we're trying to do, is trying to understand, where do these 3 big categories go? How do you actually operationalize the dynamic? And how do I make better contracts? So what I'm trying to do is 2 initiatives that I'll just push out there, and then I'll shut up for a little while, is a proactive transportation playbook and then portfolio management. These are 2 main threads we're kind of looking at FreightLab. For the proactive playbook, this is based off of some research that was done with a company sponsor in 2020, 2 students, David Sokolov and George Zhang. And so what they did is the company wanted to know forecasting. They wanted to know what were the rates going to be, right? This is starting in the fall of 2019. So they were still suffering and had scars from the previous year when the rates went way up. And so the idea was, you have this forecasting engine, and you take both endogenous and exogenous data, right? Historical rates and everything that you had in your network, plus other things from the Federal Reserve, other sources. And you try to come up with a forecasting engine for looking 1 to 6 months out. And you're looking at to predict, the market rates or the spot market rates or the acceptance ratio, and trying to look at this as fine-grained as you can. Now, suppose you come up with this, and there's a ton of methods out there you can try. We did a little bit of machine learning to come up with a better forecasting engine. And the big thing, though, is once you have this, then you start looking at it and you tie it to a proactive playbook. And it's a series of if-then statements. And so if you see that rates are probably going to be rising in a certain area, or you see some capacity crisis coming, then you might want to take an action proactively. And this is the challenge, is to determine what are those proactive actions you can take. One might be a simple call to senior leadership, make them feel important. It's shocking how effective that can be sometimes. You can trigger some accessorial pricing. Maybe you do a short-term kind of bump. Maybe you do some volume commitments or something in there. Maybe you do surge capacity. Maybe you just replace the carrier, right? You have all these actions that you can do. And what you're trying to do is get a look ahead of time and tie that to your playbook. Too often we look at the future, but it's like standing on the beach and watching a wave come in. We don't do anything. So what we're trying to do here is to tie those 2 things together. The other thing that we've been doing is looking at this portfolio, right? Instead of having just one size fits all, binding in price, not in volume or capacity, there's all these different assortments, and they've been used by different shippers in pieces. The guaranteed volumes or take or pay, guaranteed service lanes, tier-based pricing, short-term performance contracts. We've seen more mini bids in the last couple of years. We're seeing much more continuous procurement, and index-based pricing. So I could talk more about each of these, but there's a whole area here, how to form better relationships between a shipper and a carrier, or a shipper, broker, and carrier. Because the rise of brokers is really interesting, because they're buying on the spot, selling on the contract. And so this is something that's really evolved over the last 10 years, and it's changed the way that shippers are using them. All right. So let me talk for a second about index-based pricing. This is something that Angie Accacello, one of our doctoral students, is working on now. And if you're interested in this, you can please reach out to me. I'll put you in contact with her. She's running a pilot with a company testing this out, and different people have done this. So essentially what I'm showing here is time on the horizontal and then cost per load, just as a general market. And this is what the transportation market does, right? It's what I showed you in the previous slide before Mike Tyson. And if this is a contract rate and you try to make your contract rate so that you're equal above and below, right? So it's comes out balanced. This is what the carriers want. When the market goes high, they want to ignore the contract, go to the spot. And when the spot market and the market gets soft, they want to go back to the contracts. And then they want to go back up when the market gets tight again. And this is what the shippers want. I'm going to stay at the contract when the rates go high, but when the rates get soft, I'm going to go down with them, right? And so this is the fundamental problem with shippers and carriers, because the market is continuing to cycle like this. And so is there a way to keep them onto the contract? And one way is to have an index-based contract that moves based on some index, whether it's within the company or some pre-established one like CAS or DAT. And what you do is you adjust up or you adjust below based on the market, because what you're trying to do is to prevent defection of the shipper or the carrier from that auction-derived contract rate. So it's one way to look at this, and we're looking at this, seeing if how we can use that. Another way to think about this is that we're really aligning procurement across planning and execution, because that's the problem with procurement. It crosses that gap. It's a planning tool, a planning process, and it's also used in execution, because the two things that you're trying to determine is which carrier, those are the rows, and what price. And you can either do it contractual, right? I set the price contractually and I determine the carrier contractually, or it's done on the fly dynamically. And you can think of three tiers. This first tier is what we've been doing in the dominant design. Every lane gets a contract rate and I assign the carrier to it. There's also some other things you can do, is where you increase the flexibility in execution. Maybe you assign the carriers, but you allow the pricing to go up. In here in this bottom right quadrant too, you might have tier pricing. As the volume increases per week, they might get a slightly higher rate, because remember I said there's diseconomies of scale on a lane. So you increase that a little bit, or you might have some of these index-based pricing, or you could do something just the opposite. You have the prices set and you dynamically select a set from a set of carriers. And then at the top, this tier 3, this is the spot market, whether it's a private exchange that you control or whether it's just a public exchange, but it's where both the selection of the carrier and the price paid is selected shipment by shipment dynamically. And so I think we've done tier 1 and tier 3. There's a lot of move and a lot of increased interest in this tier 2. How do I add flexibility and dynamics to this process? Because I don't think anyone wants to get rid of the annual RFP. It's nice to have certainty, right? To some degree, but I think we need to allow for some dynamic flexibility. And that's what we're trying to get here. And that's what we've been trying to look at here at the FreightLab. So bottom line, dominant design for transportation procurement is static contracts determined by an annual RFP, rates fed into a routing guide with a TMS. It's broken. It's no longer sufficient. It took 2 crises within 3 years for us to get that through our heads, but it's not there anymore. And so and the reason why is because there are gaps between the procurement during planning and execution. Technologies, the RFP tool, the bidding, the mixed interlinear program is exceptionally sophisticated. There are literally hundreds of research papers on how to do that better. It's very hard to find any papers on how to make the execution system better, because us academics think that's boring, right? It's more of a workflow process. So there's a gap there. You come up with a solution here that cannot be executed. And this happens all the time. This is why a lot of shippers are trying to hack their TMSs, the transportation management systems, to make it work. And so there's a lot of opportunity there to bring these together. There's also big gap in assumptions. Strategically, in the planning process, everything's deterministic. It's this many loads per week, this many loads per year. As opposed to an execution, we know it's stochastic, it's random. And so those things need to come together as well. And so here are the 4 things that I think shippers and carriers and brokers need to do, preferably with us, but you need to do this. Identify and segment your networks. Every lane's not the same. Don't treat them the same. Better match your segments to appropriate contractual forms within that portfolio, right? Everything shouldn't go out to contract, right? Everything can't be 5 cents, what Lucy said, right? Increase the use of real-time monitoring and make it actionable. I think people need more of that proactive playbook. If you don't have a system in place that's tracking how your rates are changing, how your carrier acceptance is changing over time on a daily or weekly basis, you're missing an opportunity. And if you haven't tied that into some kind of actions, again, you're missing an opportunity. And I think shippers, carriers, brokers need to experiment more. Don't try this for your whole network. Pick out a side, try something out, see if it works. All right, with that, I'm going to stop. I think I went 35 minutes. I'm opening this now for questions, comments, suggestions. And this is my two dogs, Gidget and Wilson, and they're hoping there'll be food in the dominant design. All right, with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.